Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some seriously thought-provoking stuff.
Always up for a good deep dive. What are we exploring today?
Today we're cracking open Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess by
Uh-oh.
seenarine. And let me tell you, this book does not disappoint. It's got history, it's got social commentary, it's got a title that just grabs you, right?
Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess. Now that's a title that makes you want to know more. What's the main argument?
Well, the book dives into this fascinating and kind of unsettling connection between the domestication of animals and the way women's roles in society changed alongside them. It argues that the rise of male dominance is deeply intertwined with our control over both animals and, well, women.
Okay, I see where this is going. It's about how systems of power have historically treated both women and nature as things to be dominated and controlled.
Exactly. And it all starts with this idea of ecogynocentrism. Have you heard of that?
I've come across it, but to be honest, I could use a refresher. What's the gist?
So basically, ecogynocentric societies are those where respect for nature, and especially the Earth's fertility, was deeply intertwined with female leadership.
So societies that revered the feminine principle saw it as connected to the life-giving forces of nature. Interesting.
And get this, the book argues that this wasn't some fringe movement. It was the norm for hundreds of thousands of years. Can you imagine that?
It's a pretty radical departure from how we tend to view early human societies. I mean, we're so used to this narrative of man the hunter.
Right. But the book challenges that narrative head on. It says, hold on, what if women weren't just passive bystanders in these early societies? What if they were the leaders, the shamans, the keepers of knowledge?
Now that's a history lesson I could get behind. But is there, actual evidence to support this idea of ecogynocentrism? Or is it more of a philosophical concept?
It's not just speculation. There's actually quite a bit of archaeological and anthropological evidence that points to the existence of these kinds of societies.
Like what? Give me an example.
Take the Venus figurines, for instance. Those ancient sculptures found all over Europe and Asia.
The ones with the, shall we say, prominent feminine features.
Exactly. The book argues that those exaggerated features weren't just about aesthetics, they were symbolic. They represented fertility, abundance, the life-giving power of the feminine. They suggest that women weren't just valued for their reproductive capabilities, but were likely seen as powerful figures, possibly even leaders, connected to those life-giving forces of nature.
Fascinating. So these figurines are like little windows into a completely different way of seeing the world, a world where the feminine wasn't just valued, but revered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just the Venus figurines. Think about those handprints found in ancient cave paintings. Research suggests that a surprisingly large number of those handprints belong to women.
So they weren't just passive bystanders, they were actively shaping their culture, expressing themselves artistically alongside their male counterparts. It really flips the script on those traditional history lessons, doesn't it?
It does. And it makes you wonder, if women were so prominent in these early societies, what happened? Was there some major turning point that shifted the balance of power?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the book points to the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 years ago as a pivotal moment in this story.
The dawn of agriculture. But that seems like a positive development, right? More stability, a consistent food supply.
On the surface, yes. But the book argues that while the initial move toward agriculture may have been primarily driven by women, they were likely the ones gathering seeds and observing plant cycles. It unintentionally set the stage for a huge power shift.
Okay, so how did we go from women potentially leading these societies to, well, not? What changed?
Well, the book lays out this fascinating concept of the 7 domestications, and it goes way beyond just plants. Think about it. Fire was domesticated, then wolves evolved into dogs.
I see where you're going with this. It's like a domino effect. Each domestication leads to another, and eventually it impacts humans too.
Exactly. And as societies became more settled and reliant on agriculture, control over resources, particularly food production, became a central source of power. Think about the shift from a more communal approach, where everyone contributed to gathering food, to a system where a select group controlled the land and the crops.
And that's where men come in.
You got it. As men took on more dominant roles in agriculture, they also took control of livestock, particularly larger animals like cattle. Owning and controlling these animals became a symbol of wealth, status, and ultimately power.
So we're already starting to see the seeds of a patriarchal system starting to sprout. It's a far cry from those earlier societies where respect for the earth and the feminine seemed to be paramount.
It is indeed. And while we can't say for certain that the domestication of animals directly caused the downfall of ecogenocentric societies, the book argues that it played a significant role in this transition.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? The book goes even further, connecting this ancient history to how we view and treat both animals and women today. And trust me, it gets even more interesting from here. Right, so last time we left off with this idea that the domestication of animals, particularly cattle, played a role in shifting those power dynamics, moving away from ecogenocentrism toward a more patriarchal structure.
Right, and it's not just about cattle. The book dives deep into the domestication of horses and argues that it really upended things, particularly when it came to warfare.
Horses, really? I mean, I know they're strong and fast, but how exactly did they change the game that much?
Well, think about it. Before horses, warfare was primarily hand-to-hand combat, right? Small-scale skirmishes, limited mobility, but horses were like the ancient equivalent of tanks.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. Suddenly you've got warriors who can cover vast distances, raid settlements with lightning speed. It's a whole different ballgame.
Exactly, and the book highlights a specific group, the Yamnaya people, as a prime example of this. Around 5,000 years ago, they migrated from the steppes of Central Asia, and they were masters of horses.
And Yamnaya people. Okay, so they were like the ancient equivalent of, what, a conquering horde, sweeping across the land on horseback.
It wasn't pretty. They had bronze weapons, superior mobility, and they really disrupted those more established agricultural societies that were used to a slower pace of life.
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. Imagine those settled villages going about their business, and suddenly these fierce warriors on horseback come charging in. Talk about a culture shock.
It wasn't just about conquest, though. The Yamnaya didn't just replace the existing populations, they interbred with them. And we know this because, get this, genetic studies have revealed traces of Yamnaya DNA in populations across Europe today.
Wow, so their legacy lives on, not just in history books, but in the very genes of modern Europeans.
That's incredible. It really highlights how such a seemingly simple thing, the domestication of horses, could have such a ripple effect throughout history. It's a powerful example of how interconnected everything is. And it's not just the genes. The Yamnaya likely brought with them new languages, new beliefs, new social structures. Their arrival marked a profound cultural shift, a merging of different ways of life that ultimately reshaped the face of Europe.
It's mind-blowing. But okay, let's connect this back to the main thread here. We've got this shift from ecogenocentric societies where respect for the earth and women seemed intertwined to the rise of male dominance alongside the control of animals, culminating in this massive upheaval brought about by horses and the Yamnaya people. It's a lot to process. And I imagine it might be a little unsettling for some listeners to hear this, to think that something as fundamental as the way we relate to each other, the roles we play in society, might be rooted in these ancient patterns of domination and control.
It is unsettling. And while we can't say for certain that the domestication of animals directly caused the downfall of ecogenocentric societies, the book argues that it played a significant role in this transition. And more importantly, it suggests that these ancient patterns might still be influencing our world today, particularly in how we view and treat both animals and women.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of it. So you're saying there's a link between how we domesticated animals thousands of years ago and the way we treat animals and women even now. How so?
Well, think about it this way. Once we domesticated animals, we started selectively breeding them for specific traits, prioritizing what benefited us, often at the expense of the animal's well-being.
So over time, they became less like partners, more like commodities, tools to be used for our benefit.
Exactly, and what the book is suggesting is that we see a similar pattern in the way women have been treated throughout history. Just as those domesticated animals were valued primarily for their economic or reproductive potential, women too have been subject to systems that sought to control their labor, their bodies, and their reproductive capabilities.
So it's not about saying that women are literally being treated like farm animals, but rather that there are these unsettling parallels in how patriarchal systems have historically sought to dominate and control both.
Precisely, and the book doesn't shy away from drawing those connections, even pointing out the language used to describe both women and animals as possessions. It also talks about the economic disparities that often disadvantage them, and the threat of violence that can linger over both. It's a lot to unpack.
It's a lot to digest, for sure. This idea that those echoes of ancient power dynamics, those patterns of domestication and control, could still be playing out in our world today is, well, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, but the book doesn't just leave us in this kind of like bleak, unsettling space. There's another side to it.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get a little, I don't know, overwhelmed. So what's the other side? Is there a way out of this cycle?
Well, the book explores those potential pathways for change. It talks about breaking free from these ingrained patterns, and one of the key concepts it delves into is radical ecofeminism.
Right, radical ecofeminism. We touched on it briefly in the first part, but I think it's worth circling back to, digging a little deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a central theme in the book.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar, what exactly is radical ecofeminism? How does it offer a different perspective, maybe even a way forward?
It's kind of a mouthful, but essentially, radical ecofeminism argues that the liberation of women and the liberation of nature, they're inseparable. They're intertwined.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand. So it's not just about fighting for women's rights within the existing system, right? It's about challenging the system itself.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that those systems of oppression, the ones that justify exploiting the natural world, those are the same systems at the root of patriarchy, the subjugation of women. So we can't dismantle one without dismantling the other.
So it's about recognizing those connections, those shared roots of oppression.
Exactly. And it calls for a pretty big shift, like a real fundamental shift in our values. Moving away from a dominance-based paradigm, the one that got us into this mess in the first place.
Toward what? What would that look like?
Toward a way of being that values interconnectedness, cooperation, respect for all forms of life. The book, it actually highlights examples of cultures, both past and present, that have embraced these values, lived in greater harmony with nature, cultures where women held positions of leadership of real influence.
Interesting. So it's not just some utopian ideal. There are actual examples of societies that have functioned this way.
Exactly, and they serve as these powerful reminders that these systems we live under, these patriarchal, exploitative systems, they're not inevitable. It's a choice. We made it this way, and we can make it differently.
It's a powerful message. But if we've been following this thread of domestication and control throughout history, is radical ecofeminism essentially calling for a kind of de-domestication, dismantling these hierarchical structures imposed on both women and the natural world?
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that inherent value, that agency of both women and nature, not as resources to be exploited, but as partners in creating a more just and sustainable world.
It really makes you think, what would a world that actually embraced these principles look like? What would it feel like to live in a society that values nurturing, cooperation, our harmonious relationship with the natural world as much as, if not more than, things like competition and individual achievement?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And while Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess doesn't necessarily offer a step-by-step blueprint, it provides a really powerful framework for reimagining our future.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with all of this?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. We have to question everything, challenge those deeply ingrained assumptions about power, about control, about our place in the natural order. And then we start imagining something different, something better.
It's a lot to consider. But you're right, there's a sense of hope in that, in the possibility of creating a different kind of future.
Absolutely. Maybe, just maybe, if the domestication of animals and the rise of patriarchy marked this turning point toward a more unsustainable and unequal world, then maybe their liberation, dismantling those hierarchies, maybe that's the key to a more just and balanced future for all of us. Something to think about, right?
Definitely something to think about. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess. We hope you found it thought-provoking, maybe even a little inspiring. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep questioning everything.